Just days away from the 2023 NFL Draft, we're going to talk with Joe Goodberry and try to go round by round and figure out who the Bengals are likely to pick this year.
You are Locked On Bengals, your daily Cincinnati Bengals podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What up, Bengals fans, and welcome to another episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast. I'm Jake Liscow along with James Rapien. Today we're joined by Joe Goodberry, who you can find on the Bengals at the Brain podcast, on Twitter at Joe Goodberry, where you can find all of his content. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network here on Locked On Bengals. You can subscribe to this program on YouTube, podcast. You can follow anywhere you get your podcasts on an audio platform and become an everydayer. Maybe become a first listener. Make us your first listen of the day as we gear up for what we've been gearing up for as we approach the NFL draft. Today, we're joined one last time before the draft with Joe Goodberry. Really fumbling words here, boys. We're going to talk about the most likely scenarios. We're going to try to go through a few rounds. We're going to start at the top, of course. With the first round, we were talking about this a little bit before we started recording, and the world of players the Bengals could pick is pretty big when you're picking at 28, but let's try to isolate 5-6 guys that we think are really in play and talk about some of the scenarios where those could come up.
Yeah, let's try to isolate it. And you guys have done a really good job of kind of narrowing down things on your board, and let's project it to that 28th pick. And I think that's the fun part, because you never know who's going to fall, who's going to be there, who's not. And we were able to figure it out last year and get it down to a few guys. And so let's try to do the same. Joe, what comes to mind? To me, when I think of Joe Goodberry, I think of Emmanuel Forbes right now as the guy at 28 that just fits pretty naturally.
And I think if you were to ask me to project who would be number one, if, let's say, I pulled 500 people on Twitter to give me their responses, and I did, so far as I'm going through the list, number one is overwhelmingly Emmanuel Forbes. And what's the balance here? Is the guy going to be there at 28 is probably the biggest thing. And then number two, would the Bengals take him? And do they like this player? And all signs point to yes for the Bengals liking Emmanuel Forbes, the corner out of Mississippi State. But do I think he's going to be there? I do think his stock has been more accurate the last week or so, where we're starting to see him going at times in some mocks into the early 20s. And in that case, he wouldn't be there, obviously. So I think there is a chance. I'm still thinking like 60% chance he is in that range, because if he's not, then another corner is, and that probably changes our conversation to a different guy. But at the same time, I do think he's going to grade extremely high for them. And if he's there, he plays a premium position, you start checking all the boxes, I do think that's the most likely pick.
And how many corners are going to go in the first round? Because we talked about this. I don't remember if it was on the podcast or not, but Christian Gonzalez, Devin Witherspoon, almost certainly gone, right? Like very few worlds where they fall. And if they do, it's because something crazy has happened off the field or in medicals that we, the public, don't know about. Deonte Banks, Joey Porter Jr. expected to be first round picks as well. And Emmanuel Forbes, consensus seems to be creeping up on him. And whether that's media catching up or whatever it is, you're starting to see, like you said, the early 20s, and you might even see him in the teens this week in some final mocks that come out. You're hearing a lot of smoke connecting him to some teams to pick before the Bengals. So say it's not Forbes. Does that push Deonte Banks down? Perhaps. Does that mean that you consider Cam Smith? Do they make it 6 corners if all 5 guys are gone? Cam Smith comes out ahead of Joey Porter Jr. on our board, and the film grades aren't where he comes out on top, but the film grade, you're first, second round there. You're feeling okay about that. Do you think we see additional corners going in the first round here, Joe?
I think if it's a weird draft, if we don't have the quarterbacks go, if we don't have the wide receivers go, if some other grouping doesn't get pushed up or down a little bit, then it could happen. Normally in recent history, you only have about 4 corners that go before pick 28. So based on history, the 5th guy should be there. Now, that's what I mean. If something weird happens where a whole position is being skipped out on the first round, then yes, somebody could get pushed up. And a strong corner class, I feel like most teams are going to have these guys near the top of their board anytime. I mean, from the start of the draft, but through the teens and the 20s, one of these guys are going to be up there. But you're right. If Forbes goes and he's one of the 4, which guy's most likely of the top 5 to be there? I think Deonte Banks has a chance because he's mostly a man cover guy that doesn't play a lot of zone and doesn't have great ball skills, which are things I think teams are looking for. But honestly, I think the guy we're overlooking completely is Joey Porter Jr. I think his profile is the guy that will be there after pick 25. If I had to guess of the top 5 corners, I would have him 5th in terms of what NFL teams typically draft. The one thing I can't really put a value on, though, is the pedigree. And being Joey Porter's son, I think teams do like that stuff and say, oh, well, his dad made it. He'll know how to play. He'll know how to be a professional in the NFL. But based on traits.
Professional.
Yeah, right. As professional as Joey Porter Sr. was, right? But the fluidity, the ball skills are not there with Porter. I think he still has a ways to go in zone. Most teams are zone in the NFL anyway. So, you've got to be able to handle that to get to play early. I think Lou Anarumo would say the same thing. So he's the most likely of the 5 to still be there, I think. After
would
that,
you take him? Would you take him at 28?
Yeah, and I think he'd be a project still. But like I just said, for the reasons Lou Anarumo probably wouldn't want to start him early. I think his physical upside is there. He's super long. Usually that's correlative to getting pass breakups and being a pest of a corner. And I think he can be that. And he's a physical player. He's a cocky player. I like those things at corner. Maybe the other parts can develop as he gets older. But if it's not that, could they reach for a Cam Smith? I think you could. It's funny. He seems to be the guy that's falling the most from January to April. Our guy Marcus Mosher on Twitter just posted a consensus big board from January and then to April, and he's dropped about 30 spots total. That's Cam Smith. So is that correct? Is that real? Then I think he's looking at the 2nd round, even though we do like him.
Keith Ringo, another name just to throw out there. Not that we love it, but it is probably in that 1st, 2nd range where somebody could decide he's worth a pick. Let's talk about some of the other.
Well, DJ Turner too. Chris Sims had him 25th to the Giants.
Guess so. Yeah. I guess some people see DJ Turner that way. I'd be surprised if the Bengals do, based on the length issues. You talk about weight for Forbes.
I didn't necessarily mean for the Bengals. I just meant first rounders, like the number of corners that could go.
Yeah. Let's talk about a couple other positions here quickly that are in play for the Bengals. A couple of other names that are in play for the Bengals. What do you think about the tight ends, Joe? You think one of the tight ends is actually in play in the 1st round?
I would not. I saw some betting odds come out recently, and tight end it seemed like Vegas thinks Bengals will take a tight end, even if you're just looking at position or the top 3 players, the 3rd one being Darnell Washington after Mayer and Kincaid. I do not think that's happening at all. Number one, because I don't think either tight end is going to be there. I think both go in the top 20 picks or so, and it's just not going to be a realistic option. So do the Bengals pivot and go to the next guy? I honestly, if I had to guess, I would say Laporta is their 3rd tight end. And do you take Laporta at 28? I don't think you do. I think some teams may have him in that fringe area where, hey, again, if a chaotic draft happens and all of your 1st round graded guys go in the top 24 or so, and you're sitting there picking 2nd round players, that is a scenario where you're taking a Jahmyr Gibbs or a Laporta, I think. Otherwise, I don't expect it at all, just because I don't think it lines up. 60 seems like the sweet spot to get value at tight end.
Yeah, I agree. I think if Kincaid's there, I think they would probably take him, depending on who else goes. But if Kincaid's there, then Forbes is probably off the board, right? It's a ripple effect. And that's the interesting part is who ends up being there that would be at the top of their board. Outside of those spots, I assume defensive line. We haven't talked about it much in round 1. Calijah Kancey, if he somehow fell, I think he would be a contender for 28. Anyone else that stands out at 28 that we need to mention?
No, I do think this is the first time they could dip into the defensive line in the 1st round since Justin Smith, David Pollock, however you want to split that up. I think Kancey, I think people are concerned with the weight and the size, the length and overall. I don't know if that will affect the Bengals or not. They did have Geno Atkins, and yes, Geno is even longer than Kancey, but they did draft some of the shortest arm players in the last 20 years under Duke Tobin and Eric Steinbach, who had the shortest arms for guard of all time at the time. David Pollock, they were talking about, you have to play linebacker because his arms are so short, if you remember that. And that's why he was announced as a linebacker. Marvin was going to do a lot of things with him, but I think he fits that. And then Giovanni Bernard at the time of the combine had the shortest arms of any running back ever. Will that scare them away? Darqueze Dennard had short arms too, 30.5 inches, really short for a corner. I don't know that it'll scare them. I wonder if they have a high enough grade on him to make him that pick. I think if it's hard to project those type of things, if it's how we see it, then yeah, I do think they will. And I think he could easily be a pick. I don't know if he'll be there. I have no clue where Calijah Kancey is going to go. A guy that gets top 30 visits could go top 10. If he does, don't be shocked, right? Because some teams like, I love him, we don't need it. And then it seems like recently the Saints, one pick behind the Bengals, are doing a lot of homework on Calijah Kancey as if they expect him to be there. So now I'm like, I don't know where he's going to go in the first round. If he's there, it'll be interesting.
Teams continuously do not take the bet on this kind of player unless it's an absolutely dominant profile. And if he comes in with 33-inch arms, how much of a difference does that make? 30.5-inch arms instead. A lot more to talk about here, guys. A little bit more in the first round. Got to get to some of the rest of the rounds here. Want to make sure we get to day 3 as well. So let's continue our conversation about trying to pick the guys that are most in play for the Bengals here coming up next.
Today's show is brought to you by Built Bar. If you're looking for a delicious snack, but you don't want all of the sugar and calories, well, you got to get Built Bars in your life because they're protein-packed, low sugar, low calories, and they're covered in 100% real dark chocolate. That's right, real chocolate. And they come in a bunch of different flavors, from churro to peanut butter brownie, cookies and cream. And you're talking about 130 calories, only 4 grams of sugar, 17 grams of protein. It's the snack that is not only healthy, but it tastes great. You can get yours at built.com today. You can also go to Walmart and get a 4-pack, or if you're a Sam's Club member, go there, get a 13-bar box. Well, and then send one to Emmanuel Forbes if he's the 28th pick, because he'll be wanting to put on a little bit more weight in the NFL. So again, built.com, and Walmart and Sam's Club, the #1 protein bar on the planet.
Let's keep talking about the first round here for just a couple more minutes in case there's any other guys that we need to mention. Then we'll move on to the second round. Joe, any other dark horses that we should be talking about in the first round here? Jahmyr Gibbs, I know, James, you mentioned briefly. Anybody else?
Yeah, I've got a few other names written down. I think we've already mentioned Brian Brzee out of Clemson, the defensive tackle. Maybe if size is the issue, maybe he's over Kancey for them. And there's a scenario where he's the best player available. I could see it. And then 2 defensive ends I think we should talk about that we probably haven't. First, Myles Murphy from Clemson was originally thought of as like a top 15 guy. As soon as I saw the tape and some of the production numbers, I thought, no way. Like, this guy should definitely be closer to a second-round pick. And I think we're seeing that now. And I think the latest mock draft I saw, I think it was Chris Sims, had him 29 or 30th in the first round. So could the Bengals like him? Could he be a fit for them? I think so. I think the other guy is Lucas Van Ness from Iowa, who it's funny because I think on tape, most people thought second round right away, maybe early second round. And then he tested really well to show that there's definitely more to his game than what Iowa was using him as. A lot of times they were kicking him inside, just letting him bull rush from the defensive tackle spot. Which, again, I think the Bengals, if we were to say on this entire lineup, if they had to go out there and throw a team out there right now, it'd probably be the biggest weakness is their interior pass rush. So if you see a guy like a Lucas Van Ness, he's going to continue to do that in the NFL and slide inside and play defensive tackle and nickel packages, I could see the Bengals liking him. And in fact, he looks like Trey Hendrickson, Sam Hubbard type guy. I mean, he, with that power rushing, not really quick twitch around the arc, not a lot of moves, he seems like a Bengals type of rusher. So I think those are probably the 3 last guys that I would promote into that conversation.
If you just looked at film grades, Derek Hall, like film grades in our sheet, Derek Hall's a guy that looks like he should be in that conversation as well. Nobody's really talking about Derek Hall as a first-round pick. I maybe seen him in 1 first-round mock. That's just another name I wanted to throw out there. Sorry, James, go ahead.
No, it's okay. They better not pick Derek Hall 28th. But it is a good segue, because I think that there's going to be an effort to potentially trade down here. Not that a team will want to trade down, but the Bengals could be, Joe, picking at the start of this next tier of player. And they may have 8 guys in that tier, and they're like, all right, well, 2A, right? They're 2A guys. And be like, well, if we can move down to 35 and still get one of these guys before it falls to the 2B and get another pick, that would make sense. I could see Hall being in that. I could see some of the guys that we mentioned, because if everyone goes that we think are going to go, and all the guys we mentioned, well, a lot of these guys are going to fall to round 2, early round 2, and be picked in the 30s. So that's kind of the final thing, I think, for round 1. There is a scenario, Jake, where we get together on Thursday night at whatever time and react to Zach Taylor and maybe Duke Tobin, talk about their decision to trade down and trade out of the first round. I don't think it's likely, but it's certainly possible. They haven't done it since the 80s, by the way, trading out of the first round and not having a first round pick.
Something that we talk about a lot, and something that like a lot of times makes sense on paper and then just doesn't come to fruition for whatever reason, whether it's that they don't get the compensation that they want, whether it's that they don't feel comfortable dropping back the amount of picks, whatever it is. Joe, you remember we DM'd about this. At one point I was like, trade future picks. Let's go all in and all in a sense, like not all in, obviously. Trading future picks is a way of going all in to some degree and adding more players right now to try to push to win this year. And then the more you sit with the draft class, the more you're like, let's trade out of this draft. Let's get future picks. So, I mean, I'm not saying that I think they'll do that, but that's an idea that exists in the world. And you see teams do this. And how often have we said this year? If only they had more picks. If only they had more picks. Can you get a pick swap in a future third? Can you get a pick swap in a future fourth at some point to move back a handful of spots so they have those resources in the future? It's something that I think you have to consider at least a little bit when they know they're going to have to get cheaper at a number of positions. But let's transition. Let's talk second round here a little bit, guys. Joe, when you think about the second round we just went through that whole mock draft exercise on Friday. To me, if you miss on a tight end in the second round, you're hoping that a guy that has an athletic profile you like, whether it's Brenton Strange or Zach Kuntz, falls to you in the third or fourth round a little bit later. Does that feel like a spot where tight end is in consideration, or do you think, still a premium pick in the second round, looking at more premium positions?
Yeah, and I wonder if that's a similar situation to last year where, they take the Axel in the first round. And I remember I put a poll up right before the draft last year of what are the biggest needs left on the Bengals roster. And the top 2 vote getters were corner and defensive tackle. Well, after Dax Hill goes, what do they do in rounds 2 and 3? They actually trade up in round 2 to make sure they get the last corner that they valued at that spot. Could it be a situation where, Darnell Washington, Sam Laporta, Luke Musgrave, Tucker Kraft are second round picks, and they start going a little bit, and you're like, okay, there's only one guy left, and we're still 10 picks off. It's worth it in this draft class. We want extra picks, but do you want extra picks in what's perceived as a weak class? If you could swap one of those fourth rounders and move up, give away one of those fourth rounders, move up just a few spots to secure your guy, get ahead of teams like the Cowboys who seem to be in on a tight end, and take Sam Laporta or Tucker Kraft or Luke Musgrave, whoever's remaining of that group. I could see that being a situation. And then otherwise, it seems recently you've got a shot at like a faller. Maybe Dwan Jones is still falling at that point. Is that something they're interested in? If maybe it's the wrong tight end that's still there, maybe it's Darnell Washington and he's still there. James talked about this before we started recording, and I thought, at what point do they bypass probably what their plan is? I think their plan would be, hey, we'd love if one of those tight ends are there. If not, is that when Zach Charbonnet comes off the board? It seems to be right in that range. Is that when Keanu Benton, the nose tackle out of Wisconsin, goes off the board? Again, projected to be right in that spot. If that's the case, I could see both those guys fitting very well with this team.
Yeah, I think the other spot, like if the right tight end isn't there, it seems like the board kind of opens up. Maybe they aren't in on Charbonnet at 60 and they say, we want one of these other running backs later. I could see them trading down and addressing defensive line and going that route, or especially if they've already taken a corner. If they haven't, then to me, this screams, let's say they go defensive line round 1 and take Kancey. I think corner, tight end, it's probably going to be one of those picks at 60. It's going to be one of those positions. And I mentioned Turner. I don't think he'll fall, DJ Turner. I don't think he'll fall to 60, but if they don't have one already, I think he could be high on their board at 60 if he was there. And I know, Jake, we did a mock where he was there. I don't think that's going to happen. I think he'll probably go mid-40s if I had to guess. Will Charbonnet fall? Is there going to be no second-round running backs? Because Gibbs is probably going in the first. There's a lot of smoke, or early second. Does 20 picks go off the board there without Charbonnet going, even though he's a plug-and-play type guy? At least that's the sound of it, and clearly the third best running back. I think it's interesting because the Bengals got burned last year at the end of each round. And that's why they had to trade up for Cam Taylor-Britt. And I think you're right. They might be in a position where they want to do it again to address one of these spots. I don't think they would trade up for DeJuan Jones, by the way, but one of these tight ends, I could see that happening.
And I talked about that a few weeks ago too. I think the idea that do they see that cliff coming like they saw with Cam Taylor-Britt? I don't remember if it was on this podcast or elsewhere, but it could be a scenario where, just like you said, James and Joe, they have to go up and get a guy before they see a big gulf. Let's keep it going here. We'll get to the third round. We'll talk about day 3 a little bit as well to finish up the show coming up next.
Okay, let's talk about day 3. Assuming the Bengals don't move up, and we can talk about the third round for a second, but assuming they don't move up, I like the idea. If you told me they had, let's say they got Emmanuel Forbes, and then they had to use that 4th rounder to get the tight end they wanted, that they had a 4th on their board in the tight end room, that would feel pretty good, Joe. So I like the idea of that. That said, pick 92, everyone keeps mocking Roschon Johnson to the Bengals. Let's say they don't get a running back in the first 2 rounds. That feels convenient. You look at Dane Brugler's latest mock, a lot of these mocks, it feels like he's going to go before pick 92.
Yeah, it's a strong running back class, but I keep putting that every time. If you want, I think, a guy that has size that can also play in the passing game, and I think the Bengals do. I think most teams do, especially if you want him to run out of shotgun and run in a gap-heavy scheme. I mean, we're talking Bijan. I think Gibbs fits that, even though he's only 200 pounds. He has all the other markers. Zach Charbonnet, and then Roschon Johnson. And it's like, okay, after that, you have guys with incomplete profiles or issues in their profiles. Kendre Miller, who I think would fit and could be a 3rd or 4th round pick out of TCU. I've professed my love for Israel Abanikanda, but he's more of a mix-in 1st and 2nd down type replacement for when they want to get under center and run some zone and things like that. But he adds speed at 215 pounds. So I think, if they did it that way, they could, if he was a part of a double up situation. But I do think running back gets addressed before the 4th round. So I don't think there's many guys that fit exactly what it seems like they need. If Callahan, when he was on your show, is correct, and maybe he's just speaking of what the team looks like right now today if they had to line up, or he's speaking in how they want to line up in September, it sounds like they want a P. Ryan replacement. And if that's the case, I'm sure everyone would like to get more explosive in that situation. But at the very least, if Roschon's the last guy of that group that can do that job, don't be surprised if they push it even further. Maybe it's not the trade up in round 2. Maybe that's the trade up in round 3 to get into the right spot. It is tough. I struggle with all of these valuations where I'm like, okay, that guy's a 2nd, 3rd, 4th. And I'm like, I forget they pick so late in the round. I'm not used to it. And I wonder if they deal with that a little bit as well, where it's like,
They did last year.
Exactly. And the same would happen at tight end. So they traded up for Cam Taylor-Britt, but at tight end, they're like, yeah, that guy's a 4th round pick. Oh, he's not there. Went in the middle of the 4th round. You were correct, but he's just not where you pick. So like, you got to value that correctly. And I think Roschon probably should go early to mid 3rd round. So that means he's probably not there unless something crazy happens or he falls a little bit.
He's just such a polished player. I don't know how many times I'm going to say that. For the things you want a running back to do in the NFL, he makes good decisions. He blocks well. He's going to have to grow a little bit as a receiver, I think, but he runs with power, breaks tackles in a way that I think is underrated just because he doesn't have the top end athleticism, right? He's going to break tackles and get another couple yards. He's not going to run away from everybody, but he's scheme versatile as well. You mentioned Jahmyr Gibbs fitting the shotgun game. He's not running between the tackles a ton at Alabama. He's not running a ton of gap at Alabama. He's not on the field a ton at Alabama. And so like for whoever picks Jahmyr Gibbs early, which is going to happen most likely, they have to be comfortable with that part of his game either needing to grow or him being a player that's on the field maybe 40% of the time instead of 60% of the time. Which
I can't wait talking about that. I can't wait talking about that on Thursday night.
Let's talk about that now, though. If you're a passing team that passes it 60% of the time on a conservative day, right? Could be up to 65, 70 on some days.
Conservative. Yeah. I mean, they throw it all over. Yeah.
Right. That's what I mean. So he's going to play the majority of those snaps plus some running snaps because you're going to, still run out of shotgun. That he could be out there for, if he's the full-time guy, it could be 70% of the snaps, even without running inside. You need to run inside. That's when your P. Ryan or your mix-in comes in.
I think that's a generous estimate. If you had Gibbs and Roschon Johnson which one gets more snaps? If those are your two top running backs on your team and you're the Bengals, which of those guys gets more snaps? I would say it's
Gibbs.
Roschon Johnson.
Gibbs.
For this team, the way they work,
I think it'd be close because Gibbs would be such a weapon as a passing option, which Mixon was a good receiver last year, but wasn't really a weapon, not the way Gibbs would be. Gibbs would be a different level.
Yeah.
So I think, that does have some value. And if you're putting passing options first, I think Gibbs is as high as you could be in terms of running back.
But who's out there in the 2-minute drill?
You're right. It'd probably still be Roschon for the blocking.
Yeah. And who's out there on 3rd and 7?
Gibbs.
That could go either way. But I know what you're saying.
The way the Bengals use their running backs, that's where they put Pirine into the game. And I know that Mixon is a different player than Gibbs. I just think the way they work, that's the way that would go. Also,
I don't think real quick. I don't think we know the way they work. They haven't taken a running back that matters. This like the one that they've invested in was Pirine.
And they had a small third down back their first year. Gio was their third down back the first year, and he played just as much as Mixon.
They did like him better because he could pass. I mean, that's the thing is they prioritize on money downs the back that can pass protect. That we do know about that.
I think you're assuming that Gibbs won't be a good pass protector. A lot of people are doing that about him.
I'm assuming that he will get run over when it's an inopportune time at some point, and that's not very predictable. Even if he's okay in other moments, he just doesn't have the density that you need to stand up to some big running back or big linebacker, 250 pounds coming with a full head of steam.
How did offenses with Chris Johnson and Jamal Charles survive? How did they? Didn't those guys see 300 touches?
Do you have a tight end that can block? Something's got to give. Right. You're not sending 5 into the pattern every play.
True sample.
We're back.
A guy I want to mention as far as a running back that could be in play in the 3rd round that kind of does both of these things. It isn't Roschon Johnson or Jahmyr Gibbs. It's Tyjae Spears. Some stuff going around medically with him. Had the ACL. Is there something lingering with the ACL? He was able to test. He was able to participate in the Senior Bowl. He does kind of fit that he can block, he can catch, he can run. Might be that kind of complete-ish back that could be in play as far as being able to play on all the downs. Because when you look at some of the other running backs, like you said, Joe and James, there's a lot of guys that are good at a lot of things, but not a whole lot of guys that are going to be seen as every down guys.
Spears is like the one, as like the native draft Gibbs at 28 guy. Spears is the guy where it's like, oh, well, if you can get that, then do it. It's just like all of these guys. I don't think they'll do it at 60, but I don't think he'll be there at 92 unless the medical stuff forces him down the board. And then who knows if the Bengals cleared him right. And are willing to take him. So it's tough. I would be on board with Tyjae Spears though.
And the 3 guys we probably haven't talked about enough, that if they take them, we'll just go, yeah, okay. And other teams liked them for whatever reason we didn't circulate them enough. It would be Tank Bigsby, Devin A-Chain, and Zach Evans.
In A-Chain, size comes up with him too. I know that.
But if you would take Gibbs, you'd probably take A-Chain in the 3rd.
And I'm not saying me. That's the thing that people bring up when it comes with him. So, yeah. And
it's probably going to be a running back that we haven't talked about at some point because the way these things tend to work.
Because A-Chain is still 12 pounds. I mean, there's a big difference between 188 and 200. I mean, he's 199.
There is. No doubt about it. Let's talk day 3 a little bit as well here, guys. We've talked about a lot of the options for some of those premium picks. Joe, what are the names that you have circled? I mean, a lot of their visits, especially late, were with some very like 6th, 7th round kind of guys. Who are some of the other guys that stand out to you as potential day 3 targets?
Yeah, it's funny because we haven't mentioned offensive line. We're talking about the first 3 rounds or so. And so what does it look like if, DeJuan Jones doesn't fall or if they don't feel the need to reach at 28? When can they get a guy? And they did have some visits with a lot of guys that look like 4th, 5th, even 6th, 7th rounders, and maybe even just reaching out to guys that may be undrafted. Guys like Jalen Duncan, John Ojukwu, Warren McClendon. Those guys could be 4th, 5th, 6th rounders. And then you've got guys like Jake Witt out of Northern Michigan who had to play tight end and then they moved him to offensive line out of necessity, and he performed well and gained 70 pounds in a year. And we're talking about the smallest of smallest schools, but tested like an absolute freak. Someone's going to want to draft him. They're not going to let that wait to get to undrafted territory, because then you never know who's going to get him, especially when I think 30 of 32 teams were at his pro day and showed some sort of interest. I wouldn't be surprised if Jake Witt, who had a top 30 visit with the Bengals, is a 6th round pick because I've looked at the data for when do you find offensive linemen, starting offensive linemen, especially at tackle. It's the first 3 rounds. And after that, you might as well just spend a lottery ticket as a late guy that has athletic upside. And I think that's what Witt would offer, unless you're okay with just taking a swing backup guy in those middle rounds.
Last thing that I think that the Bengals, they want to try to address at some point. And early on in this process, Jake, remember we talked about, they always seem to take a receiver, usually in back-to-back years, and they take receivers a lot. They didn't last year. And so are they going to skip out again this year? I know it's not a great wide receiver class, to say the least. It's a bad wide receiver class, to be clear. But what are some mid-round guys that you could see them potentially being interested in, Joe?
Yes. What are the Bengals like? What do they typically draft? They drafted very well for my lifetime drafting receivers, right? They really only have a couple misses out of the whole thing. So what do they typically draft? What are the indicators? It's usually guys that came out early. So we're talking about junior, and things get a little weird because with the COVID year, there are some like 4th year early declares because they took a year when COVID hit, but they want someone who came out early. They want someone that produced at a young age. And typically they're in like the 6 foot range, 190 or so. Anything more than that would be great for them. There's a few guys that I've got that I think could fit that, all 3 of those markers at least. And I think Parker Washington out of Penn State is one. He's a slot guy. He's 5'9.5", but at 204 has good density. He's a little stubby, 72-inch wingspan, 29-inch arms, but 96th percentile breakout age, really quick, elusive, tough slot guy that I think could be a fun player for them. And then who I mocked to them in the 5th round was Raheem Jarrett out of Maryland. Very similar situation, junior, ran a 4.44. He's a slot guy. Got a lot after the catch. His 2021 season was much better than his 2022 season, and I think that's why draft nicks have cooled on him a little bit. Otherwise, I think he could have been like a 3rd or 4th rounder. Now, because there's not that many underclassmen this year, or because of the COVID year, maybe they bypass that a little bit and go for guys that are a little bit older, or, just didn't have the ability to come out early. Maybe it's a guy like Xavier Hutchinson in the 4th round or so that I think looks like Tyler Boyd in a lot of ways and could be a similar player to that. And maybe they want to go with a bigger outside receiver and let Jamar Chase get into the slot. Then that opens up the options, I think, a lot more, because maybe, I guess, as I'm saying it out loud, there's not many big guys. So are they going to get pushed up? In our rankings, I'm just looking at our rankings. It doesn't really differentiate who's the big guys and the small guys, other than looking at the size table. But if teams are like, it's loaded with slot quick guys, I'm going to take this big guy around earlier to make sure we get one. Maybe there won't be one there for the Bengals.
Yeah, the Jonathan Mingo 3rd round dream died a long time ago. Rashee Rice, though, SMU. Yes. Not an early declare, not that young producer, 23 years old, but from a body type perspective, from a skill set perspective, could be inside, can play inside out, I think. And
he looks like a Bengal receiver.
Mohamed Sanu vibes a little bit, maybe. Yeah. I've seen the Adam Thielen comp. I mean, he tested much better than Mohamed Sanu, 95th percentile athlete according to RAS.
Yeah, Rashee Rice looks quicker. Watch him versus Deonte Banks, and Banks had trouble because of the ball skill difference. Rashee Rice, instantly playing above the rim over these guys, and he's only 6 foot. And so when you see that guy that plays bigger than he is, I think the teams are going to see him as an outside guy. But he did play the slot a lot. The other guy reminded me of Marvin Jones, if we're bringing up some Bengals types that look, is Trey Palmer out of Nebraska. Deep threat, wiry body that makes a lot of sideline catches and catches. He can get up over people and make catches, but with his body. Remember, Marvin Jones used to do that. He had good hands, but for some reason he liked to body catch, secure it, and I think sometimes it limited his after the catch ability.
I'm sure there are going to be guys that we haven't talked about that the Bengals will draft. We will, of course, have you covered with analysis after the Bengals make their selections. James, any last names you want to shout out here? We obviously have our show tomorrow to do our predictive stuff.
No last ones. But yeah, I think the double dip at running back is alive and well. The Gibbs a Banacanda dream. I need a Banacanda to fall to round 5, and then it gets real fun.
2-speed, guys.
Oh my God. Good luck. Good luck.
We'll be back tomorrow for our final predictive mocks of our own here on the Locked On Bengals podcast. You can find Joe's over on the Bengals of the Brain podcast. Until next time, one more show until the draft. Thanks for listening. Hoo day, and have a good one.